Hello, hello, everyone. Welcome to our live panel, From Breaking News to Broken Narratives, Reimagining Trans Futures. My name is Jenny, and I'm the LGBTQ communities reporter at Reckon. Reckon is an award-winning national news org that covers the people powering change, the challenges shaping our time, and what it means for all of us. At Reckon, our stories are by, for, from, and about those who live the experiences we report on. And we want to thank them, Condé Nast LGBTQ National Magazine, for being part of this event. We'll be discussing how journalists can reshape media for trans liberation, especially given that anti-trans legislation is at an all-time high. Our hope is that you leave this event knowing how to counter harmful stereotypes and misinformation, amplify diverse LGBTQ voices, share accurate information, and expose biased reporting. There will be some house rules for the course of the panel that our moderator will post in the chat. We'll also have an open Q&A where you can submit your questions for the panelists. Please keep it respectful. With that being said, I'm so excited to welcome the Avengers team for our panel. We have Erin Reed, an independent journalist who's been keeping track of anti-LGBTQ legislation. We have actress, writer, and journalist Eva Rain, who hosted Transnational at Vice News, which received a GLAAD Award. It was also her birthday recently. We have James Factora, a writer, musician, and fellow staff writer at them. And last but not least, we have Muna Mire, creative director, producer, writer, and one of the architects of the New York Times letter that went public this February in response to the Times coverage of anti-trans rhetoric. Thank you so much to the four of you for taking time out of your busy schedules and being here with us today. Before we start, though, I would like to ground us in why we're here today. Coverage on trans and non-binary communities by several conservative outlets have mobilized the anti-trans movement. Even reports on the murders of trans people are bleak and desensitized to violence, which was why at Reckon, I started the series When You Were Here, where I speak with the loved ones of the victims about who they were, what music they listened to, who they were in love with, what futures they dreamed of. And despite where the trans community stands today, we're more than just our struggles. And this series is a small role in this larger scope of trans coverage that I feel very passionate about, and I hope our conversation can illuminate better ways we can report on trans and non-binary lives. So now that we've got the intros out of the way, let's get started. I'd love to start by setting the stage and naming the problem. And so this question's for everyone. What do you think are the biggest issues in trans coverage in the US? And what do you think is the root of the problem? What's causing so many media outlets to get this wrong so often? And anyone can start.
I can jump in here. I was one of the signatories to the GLAAD letter to the New York Times, and I have often criticized traditional media in the way in which LGBTQ issues, especially issues around trans care, are portrayed in our national journalistic outlets. And something that I've noticed, I've followed this issue for a very long time. I know all of the players in the game. I'm very familiar with the organizations that push anti-trans legislation and the tools and misinformation that they use to do that. And I should not know more about this than the biggest media institutions out there. They should have fact checkers. They should have editors that are competent in discerning truth from misinformation whenever it comes to gender affirming care. But what we see is organizations like the New York Times and other media organizations as well essentially give equal credence to, on one hand, all of the medical organizations, the scientists, all of the people that have been doing this work for a very long time. And then this one crackpot anti-trans doctor. And we've seen this in the legislatures. They parade them in front of the legislatures and say, well, here's the doctor that doesn't support this. We've seen this in the media, like in the New York Times, where they will interview, one anti-trans and one pro-trans doctor and pretend that there's a middle ground there that is somewhere in the middle. But we've also seen this attempted in the court fights. And what we've recently seen in the last month are six different states see their gender affirming care bans overturned in the courts, because when you actually analyze it in a courtroom, you have to defend your position using scientific evidence. It always fails. And so I think that what we're seeing in the courtroom should give media organizations like a pause. And they should ask themselves why they've gotten it so wrong, why they've tried to pretend that there is this middle ground that they're trying to land on, when in reality, every single time, and we're not talking about liberal judges, 3 of the judges that did this were Trump appointees. Whenever you have to defend it in court, you see that it doesn't fall that way. And so I think that, yeah, that's one of the biggest problems that we see in trans coverage in international outlets.
I can go next if that's cool. I think, yeah, totally seconding like everything that Erin said. And I also think in general, there is a huge lack of analysis of race in a lot of trans coverage, and specifically like transphobia as a symptom of violent white supremacy. We see there was like one of the like Proud Boys in Florida, or maybe it wasn't, I think it was actually somebody who was like a leader of like a neo-Nazi organization in Florida, who talked about how the like anti-trans and like anti-drag kind of like animus was the most successful recruiting mechanism that they've seen in like basically ever. And so I think there is that, and it's also the fact that like Ron DeSantis is like banning, critical race theory and like diversity, equity, and inclusion alongside enacting laws like Don't Say Gay, for example. And then of course there is the fact that like, trans people are not a singular community with singular experiences. Like the vast majority of like transphobic and trans misogynist violence is enacted against like Black trans women and other trans women of color. And I just think that all of these things are connected in ways that aren't quite teased out by the media in general. And I think that that is, yeah, just not really understanding the sort of seriousness of violent transphobia and transmisogyny as a sort of building block for white nationalism and fascism, and one that's working pretty well according to the white nationalists.
Institutionally, I think there's also a lot that needs to be addressed, just when it comes to the ways in which a newsroom operates and who they employ, and who they employ as freelancers, permalancers, staff members. There are a lot of ways in which trans journalists are not supported to do their job. And I think that really needs to be addressed. Because also, even when we are in the room, we should not be the only ones discussing these issues. We are not the only ones who are aware of it. We're not the only ones who are impacted by it. So I really think it's up to editors to also really do their due diligence, to really think about how they treat the trans talent on their teams, how they go about finding new trans talent, and also what they do in order to keep those people around them, to make sure that they have the proper support needed. And also, there's a lot of like there are several like far right players who are very much trying to strike down on our rights, but there's also a lot of people who are being totally indifferent to these matters. And that also has a major impact. Oftentimes when we talk about these issues, there's the left and there's the right, but there's also people who claim to be in the middle, which has been addressed. But there's plenty of people who I think like claim to be allies, and who like work in media claiming to be a ally, and yet they're not really doing the work to stop these negative stories from being published, to talk to their peers about what's happening. Like there are a lot of people who are silent on these issues, and through that silence, these loud, ignorant, blatantly bigoted voices are going to pierce through the noise. And I think that also needs to be addressed, because it's those people who are being totally complicit to the issues at hand that are really aiding in our struggles.
I think there's a way in which trans people's bodies have become a rhetorical proving ground for different people's ideologies. And I think that ultimately it functions as a process of consent manufacturing, where you see these ideas from the far right sort of being laundered through respectable channels like the New York Times, channels that have like a sort of authority to them. And it could be because of underlying personal biases on the part of the staff, right? It could be management, it could be editorial. It's the fact that there's no trans folks on staff to catch these things, and again, not just the one. And I think it's also this sort of like pursuit of false objectivity, where we do this both sidesism, where we treat the two sides as though they're, we take them both equally seriously when one is sort of determined to exterminate trans people. So it's like, why are we even giving that the time of day type of thing? And I think it's really tough because we have this like outsized focus, right, on not just trans people who are, a small minority, but even within that small minority, an even smaller group that I think is really driving this coverage. And part of that is clicks, right? Part of that is wanting to retain a center-right audience. So they really want to have it both ways. And I think that's really perverse, and they tend to cover it with this idea of objectivity that isn't real.
Yeah, and I'm glad y'all touched on this large orchestrated push by the far right to mainstream essentially transphobia, and I definitely want to go back to that. And if we can sort of backtrack a bit, Erin, you started your work while tracking healthcare resources and quickly found yourself in a position as a nexus for all things anti-trans legislation. And you mentioned in your interview with Study Hall that you're often the only person who reports on these legislative hearings. And Eva, you touched on that too, being one of the only people on staff, if at all, Erin, can you share a little bit about what you've learned in doing this work that you've done so far?
Absolutely. And yes, I did start this about 3.5 to 4 years ago whenever I had compiled all of the hormone therapy clinics for trans people into a map. Prior to that, it was very hard to find this information. And I remember actually having to drive 6 hours round trip to go get my hormones, and I'm in DC. So, there were closer clinics to me, but everything's word of mouth. Everything was held in these online forums and such. And I compiled those resources together, but then I started following the legislation because the laws were targeting the clinics that I was tracking, and the people that I had gotten in touch with started telling me about that. So I very quickly had to learn how to read these laws. And, whenever I had said that often I'm the only transgender journalist covering these hearings, it's important to realize the scope, like the magnitude of what we faced this year. We have seen 531, according to my tracker, everybody has slightly different numbers, but 531 anti-trans bills this year. For every one of those bills, there's a hearing somewhere. Many of those bills have multiple hearings. So we're talking about, thousands of hearings this year on transgender topics. It was one of the most commonly heard type of bill in legislatures. In Nebraska, it took up 81 days of their state legislature because of the filibuster there. And so given that we've got thousands of laws that were being heard in hearings, and each one of those hearings could go 3 to 4 hours, you can see the vast need for somebody to be in that room or watching the hearing and reporting on it versus the lack of people employed in local media, for instance. I mean, we already know that local media has been struggling lately. Local journalism is something that has been on the decline for a little while, as large national outlets and social media forces have kind of rendered a lot of them unable to continue to exist. Even if there is a local reporter in that room, and many times there are not, I know because I've been the only one reporting on several of these hearings. A lot of times that local reporter is just going to be, a cis, straight, white person, and that they don't have the background, they don't have the lived experience to know that this thing that was just said is actually extremely newsworthy for the trans community. But they don't know that because they might not realize the American College of Pediatricians is actually a right-wing organization that launders homophobia and conversion therapy. These are things that I often have to watch for and report on. And so, I think that this just goes to show, we need more people doing this work. We need more people watching these hearings. We need more people there to be the one to break this news and to show. I had to miss probably a good 800 of these 1,000 hearings that were out there this year. And I don't know what happened in them. I can only listen to some of the activists that showed up that fed me information. And so, it just goes to show there are I want to actually close off by saying that it's important to watch these hearings and report on them, because the things that are said in these hearings have led to the overturning of some of these laws. In Florida, for instance, the judge literally used some of the things that were reported from the hearings, some of the statements that were said in the hearings, to overturn the law because it was clear that the person was acting with unconstitutional animus. The person said, I think that trans people were demons, mutants, and imps. And you hear something like that, and it's good that it was reported on, because if it had not been reported on, that law might still be in effect. So yeah, we need good local reporting. We need good people that are watching these hearings. I've spoken to colleges with college groups and stuff like that. And they always ask me, it's what can we do to support you? And my biggest thing is watch the hearings. Get in there, watch the hearings, record them. It's a lot. You need to record them and make sure that you've got clips. Make sure that this doesn't die in darkness. We need to see what happens.
Yeah. And even, trans identity aside, there are clearly many factors that come into play to shape our different experiences. And it can't just be limited to gender or sexuality. And I know, James, you touched on it too earlier with intersectionality, but, our race, our ethnicity, our nationality, age, ability, citizenship, religion, class background, all of these things shape our experiences in addition to transness. And I guess my question is more of an actionable, but how can we better our journalism and I guess, our role in media in making sure reporting is more nuanced and intersectional?
I think a big thing is actually deferring to expertise. So in our New York Times letter, we called out the fact that a bunch of, they actually spoke to a bunch of trans experts who warned them specifically what to stay away from, how not to report things, and they went ahead and did it anyway, right? So not only did they waste their time, they wound up sort of leveraging their work just like very in bad faith, right? Um, and I think, with objectivity, we've seen the same challenges when it comes to Black reporters in the newsroom. For example, covering police violence, right? There's this idea of, oh, your lived experience can't actually come to bear on this because that would, compromise the objectivity and therefore our authority. So then it becomes a question of, hey, like, pursuit of the truth in actual fact is an ideology in and of itself, right? So it's like, I think we have to be careful about objectivity. And when we talk to folks, I think we have to let them be experts and speak to their own knowledge of their lived experience, or if it's academics or researchers or what have you, it's like, we'll actually listen to what they're saying, right? A lot of these folks are grifters, sort of posing as experts, right? There's a lot of junk science flying around, right? Like, I think, that, and also fact checking is really interesting to me because I don't know if I don't want to get into the whole context of it, but if folks remember the St. Louis gender clinic scandal and the fact that the fact checkers at New York Magazine sort of revolted and, claimed, this is not, we never would have approved of this, right? But we have to remember that fact checkers are young, they're junior staffers, they're not very high up on the editorial chain. And people can stet fact checks too, right? Like, say I'm a fact checker, I'm checking your work, I say, hey, this isn't totally accurate. I can just stet that as an editor, right? I can say, actually, this is fine, like, don't worry about it. Like, I'm pulling rank here. So it's like, okay, we have these systems in place, but we're not using them honestly. And so it's not coming to bear on the quality of reporting. And that's a shame.
Yeah. And that makes me think of how, Eva, your transnational project, I can imagine sharing a lot of the same experiences as the people you were on the ground with, made a big difference in how that story was told. I'm curious to know, to hear your perspective on that too.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, this is something that's come up quite a bit. I mean, okay, so obviously, as a Black trans woman, it's much easier for me to report on what's happening with other Black trans women. Like, that simply makes sense. The issues that arise out of doing that is when I am in the edit with people who are not of that experience, because journalism was built by white men, right? Like, it was built by like white cis men. So just from a systematic level, it's always, like, when you're taught how to report and how to write and how to speak on different issues, you're taught to have this, this like objective view, to be like out, to be like outside of this experience. What does that look like when you are of the experience? How do you, obviously do a story justice, but also, have like, I guess, like this sort of like wall up as a journalist? It's like a really difficult thing to manage. And I think that wall has been breaking down for a while. And I think that as a industry, media needs to, you know, like stop telling people to like put their feelings aside when they report on things. Obviously with Vice, that wasn't the instance. That's why I was very excited to work with them, because it was one of the first times where I was entering a project, and my views on things, like I wasn't being pushed aside. That's been my experience in different newsrooms before, which also is why I am not quite as active as I once was, because I found myself constantly being undervalued, and I found that my voice was not being uplifted. And I got tired of it, you know, like I got tired of um there being stories that obviously I can speak to and that I would have been more qualified to write on, and people just doing the whole everyday like status quo sort of approach to it. When it comes to, you know, like when it comes to the reporting on the violence against Black and brown trans women, you know, there's a lot of ways in which we need to evolve on talking about these issues, because Monica Roberts was the one who really started tracking these murders over a decade ago. Rest in peace. And she was the first one to really center these issues, to really talk about them in a way that was actually seeking to rectify the issue of this epidemic. And since then, you know, there have been numerous journalists who have really turned the tide on how we talk about this. But now we're in this state where when violence occurs, it's, you know, it is kind of like the standard write-up. It's this constant countdown of like, oh, number 27, number 38, you know, and it's like, we're past that now. We need to really humanize these stories more. You know, so Denny, you know, like I love the work that you've been doing where you've been talking to people about like what someone's hopes and dreams were. Because a lot of the write-ups that we see now, it's like, oh, you know, like it'll say someone like Kelly Duke, or whatever someone's name is, was a Black trans woman living in South Side of Chicago. She was gunned down, you know, on like this corner, blah, blah, blah. Rest in peace. That's it, you know. And it's like, yo, can we like really talk about this person's life and talk about the impact this person had, and the fact that this has been a trend, and there are factors at play. Like there are, you know, there are men who are hunting us down. There are jokes being made, and without going into the whole thing, because I'm starting to get a little sweaty thinking about it. There is so much more that can be done. And frankly, I don't even have to lay it all out. If we can spend months hunting down a famous person to talk about her favorite pair of Jimmy Choos, I think we can spend a few hours making sure that that woman who was murdered in Louisiana is properly named, properly gendered, that her, you know, that her family is also notified, and that they are also uplifted in the process. Yeah, and you know, I think when people talk about the violence against trans people, specifically trans women of color, I think it's interesting how there's also been a trend of like, you know, like there's like the quick mention of trans, you know, like trans women of color have a life expectancy of 35. Like it's kind of just become like the buzzy thing to do, without any real investigation into why that is. Uh, and I think a lot of journalists have followed this trend because they feel obligated to, which you are. But you also have to go deeper, because if every blurb looks the exact same over the last like 7 years, I think we have a serious problem.
Cool.
And I think there's just a lot more that can be done. Yeah, I'm done with my talk. Okay.
No, I'm glad you said that, because even like deducting a person who was killed into a number 27, like outside of what we do, all five of us here do, like to read that, that's horrifying. And then to read, oh, like you said, found in a corner, stabbed 12 times. And this is where, and case never gets solved. This is where the story ends. This is the amount of reporting we can do. And that's why, I'm so glad we have outlets like them, James, where there is this really for us bias baked into it, into the storytelling. You work at a national magazine that's specifically by and for queer and trans people. And so I'm curious, James, in your perspective, how does having trans folks behind the scenes make a difference in the stories that get shared?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously like, first of all, something that I literally, not a single day goes by that I take that for granted. Like, I feel like so lucky to be able to, be in this incredibly unique position. I think like there's just like a lot of inter-community nuance that I don't necessarily have to explain, like when I'm pitching stories, whether that's silly blogs or like more serious, like, reporting. I You dropped it in, or someone dropped it in the chat, but I recently profiled this trans chef, Silver Yokovozi, and I remember I was like talking about the story with like my uncle who was in town recently, and he's like obviously a cis dude, and he was like, "Oh, so like you're gonna like talk about his transition, like, and the story," which I was like, no, and that's literally not something that ever occurred to me, and it's not something that like ever came up in the editorial process because it's simply not relevant. And I think that that was like a moment that made me be like, okay, yeah, it is like really nice that I am kind of on this team where things like that are like, of course, you're not gonna kind of like hyperfixate on this one aspect of this trans person's life in a story where that's like not relevant, just for the sake of like cis voyeurism, basically.
Mm,
Um, and yeah, I just think in general, like we, you know, I really appreciate that we just kind of make space for conversations, and, you know, giving like profiling like community figures who are like important to like the trans community but maybe aren't like super well known like outside of that. Like someone wrote a really beautiful tribute to Myra Bellwether, who wrote the zine Fucking Trans Women. There's this column at them called T for T, which is like stories about transness, like by trans people, and like without the need for the kind of like without the need for like the annotated for cis people version, if that makes sense. And I think just like in general, like something that I appreciate overall about working on a staff, where I'm not the only trans person, uh, is that like we tell stories that aren't just about, like, we do also obviously like cover, anti-trans violence and anti-trans policy, um, and also trying to kind of like put a human face to like these things, but also just that like we make space for stories about trans joy and also like trans irreverence. Like we did a story where we talked about like, I don't know, like Breaking Bad and like why like trans Gen Zers love like kind of these like anti-hero shows and like just like yeah, so I appreciate that there's kind of room for like all of it, I guess. And that I I am encouraged also to kind of like, come to the table with ideas for like what is like missing from the media landscape in terms of like trans coverage, like what kind of like outdated sort of tropes do we want to avoid, things like that.
Yeah, and I loved that fucking trans woman piece. It was so beautifully done. And actually, on that note, I'm curious to know, Erin, Muna, like, what are some trans-led storytelling you've seen that you've really enjoyed recently?
I always say that queer joy is important to put forward. And I say, often in some of my speeches and such that is our resistance. Like that's the heart of it. The idea that we can be joyous in front of people and that people deserve to see that. And so whenever it comes to media representation and trans content creators, et cetera, I think that it is so important that people include that in their media diets. So if you go back to before 2010 and you watch any comedy, there's like a 50-50 shot you're going to get like a wanton transphobic joke. It's going to be terrible. I mean, you watch like Saturday Night Live in the 90s, and they had an entire sketch called It's Pat, and it's all about a gender non-conforming person. Oh my God, that's the punchline. We're either the punchline of a joke or the victim or perpetrator of a crime. And so I think that's why it is so important that today we include trans and queer content creators, celebrities, writers, musicians. I actually last year I had a thread, and I'm going to try to drop it in the link after I finish talking. I did a thread of like, who are your favorite trans musicians? Like, we all know some of the big ones, Kim Petras, et cetera, but like, there are so many musicians out there that are trans that are really great. And like, it was my chance of introducing people who follow me that might not be queer. I've got a large number of cishet people that follow me, to like hear some amazing music done by trans people and queer people. Same with, people who are on television and people who are in movies. I watched Amy Schneider dominate Jeopardy for 2 months and become one of the winningest contestants in Jeopardy history. And the reason why that matters is because all of these trans kids that like are in their families and their families watch Jeopardy on the television, they can see like, how's my mom reacting to Amy Schneider right now? How's my dad reacting to Amy Schneider? And if they see like really positive reactions, like maybe they feel a little bit safer to come out. And if they see negative reactions, like maybe you understand that as well. And so, yeah, I just think that like, I'm going to try to drop that thread in because it was a really good thread. And I think a lot of people would enjoy the music that I found there. I actually always find myself going back because I still haven't listened to it all. There's so much good music. But I'll leave the rest for other people. I think that there are probably a lot of people with good suggestions. I also wanted to suggest real quick at the tail end, there's a book called Red, a crayon story, and I have to push that one forward. It's not written by a trans person, but it has so much applicability to queer and trans people, especially queer and trans parents. It was actually originally written about neurodiversity, and it was describing the neurodiverse experience. But you read this book and like you realize that there's so much cross applicability, which is kind of like part of what we've been talking about, the fact that intersectionality is so important and that we all share various elements of the struggle for rights and for liberation. And so this book was written about a crayon that was blue but had a red label, and it was all about like how this crayon was told to color various red things and was always really terrible at it, but whenever they were allowed to color an ocean, they soared. And, I use
Oh.
that to explain my own transness to my son, who was 4 years old, 3 years old at the time that I transitioned. And so, there are so many things like that. Let me also plug in Kay Jemison, who wrote the 5th season sci-fi. I love queer Black-led sci-fi. Like, it's always good. And I'll drop that link in as well. I'll drop all the links in a second and I'll move on.
Muna, you have any recs?
Yeah, so a friend of mine, Heron Walker, is a fabulous profile writer. And she's one of the few trans women, I think, in like the long form magazine space. And she recently profiled Dylan Mulvaney. And it was a really great piece. And it was just like, she had a really like nuanced and sensitive take on everything that happened with her. And I thought it was just like very thoughtful. And then also the TV show Veneno, which for some reason it hasn't really popped. It's not brand new. It's been out for a while, but I tell people about it all the time. It's really great. I think it just does a really good job of like speaking to someone's legacy while also like giving them leeway to be sort of like fun and imaginative and fantastical with it. Kind of plays with this idea of like narrative and telling our stories and like reliability, and it's just like a really, really beautiful series, Spanish language.
Yeah, I think it's like a prequel or something, spin-off, something coming out, right? I saw a trailer recently.
Sure. Highly recommend.
And so, well, first of all, thanks for sharing those. And yes, please, everyone else, if you want to put some in the chat, please do. So, we still know that journalists across the board are still somewhat, failing at trans coverage. And Muna, you talked about it earlier, treating what should be understood as fundamental human right, more like a semantic debate, this sort of false two-sided storytelling. And it's become such a contentious pattern at the New York Times that this February, contributors and members of the staff posted an open letter protesting the paper's bias. And you are one of the few people who helped pen that letter. I'm curious to know what can you share about how that letter was received, and maybe what the next steps are for that publication for those who need to make changes as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was received very poorly, to say the least. And the actions taken afterwards were just really draconian, in terms of like censoring the people who signed on internally within the Times. I think that, I'm a freelancer, and the folks who came together to write the letter were all freelancers with the Times. So we have a different relationship to the institution, whereby we just have like a little more flexibility. Like, hey, if I'm burning a bridge, I'm burning a bridge. And I kind of made that calculation after the Katie Baker piece, actually, where, it kind of came to this like point of discoursing about whether kids could be out at school or not, or if parents were like teachers were obligated to inform parents if like students went by like a different name or what have you at school. And I think, yeah, something about that piece just really, really deeply unsettled me. And we started penning the like letter not too long after that, actually. But yeah, staffers obviously have a different relationship to the institution. They're a lot more beholden to the ethics code. And so when we called them out, we very much were like calling them out on their own terms. We were using their own definition of what bias was. We had, a number, a figure of how much front page, how like the word count they dedicated A1 front page to these stories, these really inflammatory stories. And, the Times I think was a bit taken aback, right? Like it was 1,200 freelancers. That's a lot of people. I think there's about 2,000 staff writers at the Times. So if that gives you an idea, like 1,200 people with a byline coming to you, not beholden to institutional codes of conduct so much as other folks, and able to say and able to call out these specific pieces, these instances of bias, the ways in which these sources were not vetted and sort of like it, you know, there was kind of like almost editorial subterfuge about the fact that these people had agendas. You can't just say, oh, such and such person detransitioned and so is speaking to their personal experience of detransition. That doesn't actually work when that person is the head of an organization that pushes junk science, that has an agenda legislatively or what have you. You see, it's like there's a lot of like slippery, tricky stuff like that where sources are just used in bad faith to make arguments that really make no sense, like once you hold them up to the light a little bit. And yeah, the Times combed through not only that list of 1,200 people, but like the additional 34,000 people who were, you know, readers, subscribers, media workers, like anyone who wanted to sign on, basically. People who were featured in the Times, very prominently profiled in the Times. They just like, they went through the whole thing and they tried to find anybody they could to essentially bully about not even writing it, but like signing on in solidarity. And so, yeah, I think we've seen a lot of pushback, obviously, especially like in social media, but then we also see that folks tend to dismiss social media as like a legitimate arena for criticism, right? Like you're just sort of like shrill activists on social media. We are like the serious institution approaching this with gravitas. So, you know, again, it's this question of authority, right? And it's funny because when we did engage them through their channels, right, we were told, hey, if you want to make a note of this, like if you want to engage them, like the best way to do it is to write an editorial letter to the standards desk. And so we did just that, and they freaked out anyway. So you tell me, you know?
So I guess, well, I guess outside of that, um, and looking ahead now, you know, that we've reached a little over halfway through the year now, what, and this is for everyone, and what do you believe needs to change inside of newsrooms and in marketing and media to better trans coverage, particularly as anti-trans movement, you know, continues to ramp up with the election year just right around the corner? Oh my gosh,
I
Katie.
don't mean to like start in right again, sorry, but if I can just speak to this because it literally just dovetails off of what I was about to say. The unions got involved. What ended up happening is the unions protected the staffers and like said these Time staffers who spoke out were, it was concerted activity basically for them to have this speech concerned about their workplace standards and such like that. So once that happened, like it was kind of like, okay, like this fight is now, the unions are taking it up. And so I just feel like unionizing your workplace and like collective action and just kind of like lots of people putting pressure on management and editorial is really the way to go. I don't know if there's like a fact checkers union. I don't think there is, but like something like that would be very helpful. Yeah, so definitely unions.
I was speaking to a journalist, a trans journalist who will remain unnamed, but I spoke to her about this several months ago, and one thing that she had noted to me is that if we could get mainstream media to cover trans issues, to cover trans issues in the sort of way that like we saw the evolution of how journalistic outlets covered climate change, that would be a huge step forward. Because what you see is that many neutral journalistic outlets that try to remain fair and balanced, quote unquote, they realize that like there is no two sides to climate change, that climate change is real, it's happening, there's scientific evidence behind it, and we need to cover it that way. We don't give credence to a random oil executive the same way that we give credence to, you know, NASA. And they saw that. Now I think, you know, climate journalism still has issues, but those issues are not where they used to be. You know, I was just Googling just now, and I was looking up climate journalism. And I just saw in 2022, the AP released a massive initiative, a sweeping climate journalism initiative, where they are like creating their own climate journalism desk. They're releasing all of the guidelines, and I'm reading it right now, and it's all about like not giving, you know, credibility to false narratives around climate change, et cetera. And like, we need that for trans coverage. We need a sweeping trans coverage initiative where our major media outlets like the AP and Reuters, et cetera, say that like, we're going to counter the anti-science claims by the people who seek to do transgender people harm. And if we could get that, like, that would be wonderful. The science is behind us. You know, we see Yale released 51 different studies that affirm that gender affirming care saves lives. We see the statistics around how transgender people are uniquely harmed by these laws, and especially how, in relevance to some of the conversations that we were having before, how Black trans people are uniquely impacted by several of these laws. The harm that's done to us. There are so many facts that are out there that don't need to be both sides. And if we could get, you know, those initiatives the same way that we've had them in other arenas, then I think maybe people would realize that like, this is one of those things that you don't need to try to both sides. Like, there is an objective answer to the reality of how gender affirming care is provided and how, you know, its positive effects on the people that need it, et cetera. And so, yeah, I just think that like having better journalism and having that promoted by our major outlets would be really important.
James, Eva.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, I think also just like one of the obvious answers is to simply hire trans reporters. Like there's a lot of really talented trans reporters, like, you know, out of work or like freelancing right now. And, you know, beyond just like the fact that it is good to have like a diverse like newsroom, I think it's also like more news organizations could stand to develop the understanding that like by hiring like trans reporters who have like developed a beat and like a unique understanding of, you know, the landscape of anti-trans rhetoric and anti-trans policy, like usually over the course of like several years, like you're uniquely positioning yourself to sort of you know, meet what will be the hellstorm of 2020, of the 2024 election, because we're already seeing like, you know, so many Republican candidates using anti-trans rhetoric in their campaigns. And I also, and it's like, you know, I think someone mentioned earlier, it's like a lot of people don't like, are not always equipped to understand that a lot of that is just misinformation, which like might seem obvious, you know, to us, but to other, like, yeah, just like, I think just in general, kind of like just respecting the sort of like unique knowledge of trans people. And then I think also just like hiring and training like more trans editors, where it's like editing is obviously an entirely different skill set from reporting. And, you know, being edited by a trans person is just very different from being edited by a cis person, like generally speaking. And I just think that like more organizations should be, utilizing their resources, creating like fellowships and mentorships that, really like recruit and like train trans people for like editorial leadership positions. And then I also think that they shouldn't get stuck in the sort of perpetual like fellowship cycle that a lot of marginalized journalists get stuck in, and that those fellowships should lead to like actual staff jobs.
Branching off of what Aaron mentioned, these issues they absolutely need to be centered. I think there's this really interesting thing happening in media where the far right is talking about transness, obviously in very negative ways, but then media that's more on the left is still looking at trans issues as like this niche thing. Like they're not really looking at it as a major concern. And it comes down to what they're what they are trying to like prioritize, because yeah, like even as like with the different types of media that I've worked on, whether it's more serious news such as a murder or it's something on fashion, whenever the mentioning of queerness or transness pops up, it's kind of just like pushed off to the side, and it's not really seen as a piece of media to really push. And I've seen that from lots of other people's work also. Like even 'cause the thing is, like, there's a lot of journalism being put out. There's a lot of good journalism being made that is actually trying to center trans issues, but the actual outlets that are publishing that, many of them are just kind of throwing it out there, and they're not really like trying to put that above the noise of the algorithm, and I think that's one of the core issues, because even when trans people have the mic, the volume gets turned down, and that's something that I think really needs to shift, because there's people doing the work, but if people are doing the work and they are devoid, they are really trying to devote their lives to this work, and that work isn't being centered, that work isn't being properly appreciated, it's easy to burn out. And I think that like there just needs to be more of a focus on us, because like there hasn't been a centering really from the left side of the spectrum. I hope that made sense.
Yeah. I love the idea of turning the volume all the way up, and I love having a queer trans editor, love a union, and love treating it like climate change reporting, which I've never thought about before, but it makes so much sense, the way you framed it. And I guess my last question before we move on to Q&A is, again, thinking ahead, with the elections, there's definitely going to be an opportunity for anti-trans movement to expand, to mobilize even further. And so what do you all suggest we need to do in preparation of that? And what's our action plan?
I think in general, like I feel like there's a lot of airtime given to a lot of just like completely irrational, illogical, right-wing rhetoric about trans people. And I think sometimes people will respond to something like, like the gender cabal is like out to trans your children with like, actually, fact check, there is no gender cabal or whatever. And I just think that like instead of like trying to debate fascists, and I also think that people need to get serious about calling that like what it is. Like I think that more people could be, which I also think that this is separate from like fact checking, like, things that could easily be like believable. Like what Aaron said earlier about the American College of Pediatricians, like that's a totally legitimate seeming like institution, and that is something that people should be really loud about saying, like, that is not, they're not like a real medical organization. But I think like when it comes to, yeah, just like things that are like just totally like outside of reality, like I think instead of like devoting like time and energy and resources to like trying to like change people's minds who are frankly kind of like already lost, um I would really love to see like more people kind of focusing on like, just like echoing what someone else said earlier, just really humanizing uh people who are affected like by these like high level policy decisions, and showing people that like, when you restrict access to like gender affirming care for minors, like this is like what happens, like these are the people who have to uproot their entire lives, to get access to life-saving care. um this is, these are the consequences, basically. I think just like really illustrating the consequences uh is something that I would like to see more of.
What about the rest of y'all?
I think that in general, I'm going to agree with a lot of what James just said. I think that there are so many good LGBTQ journalists out there. Like there are a lot of them, and many of them are struggling as freelancers right now and just trying to get their careers off, trying to report on these issues. And whenever we talk and whenever we criticize media outlets for like their lack of good coverage, their lack of representation, et cetera, it's not a supply problem. We've got people ready. And the GLAAD letter, whenever I had signed on the GLAAD letter, one of the major things the GLAAD letter had said was that hiring LGBTQ journalists is a big part, and also letting them cover the stories. I think that like we need to continue to put pressure on our outlets to do that. And I think that like, local outlets as well, we need to increase our support for local outlets, and we need to also focus our need for inclusiveness on smaller outlets, not just our biggest, publications. I've seen good work done locally. I've seen good work in Texas done locally. I've seen good work in Tennessee done locally. There are good people reporting out of there. And so likewise, like I think that all of us here, we all have media chops. We all have some level of ability to influence the conversation, and like it's up to us to uplift, other journalists that are doing work as well. And I think that like it's a responsibility that I've always taken, a lot of care in. And I think that collectively we need to ensure that we are supporting one another and that we're helping each other. And that's why I'm glad to be part of this panel here,
I will just say, in my opinion, I think we need to stop playing rhetorical games a little bit, in like a tough love way. I think that the enemy, so to speak, or at least in terms of the far right, they have entire conventions about tactics and rhetoric, and they're very like strategic minded in the way that they approach things. So I think it's useful not to cede ground rhetorically. So like James was calling out, like sometimes it's better not to respond to people, and dignifying their, what they say with the response is kind of ceding ground already, right? When people don't call it activism on the far right, or like assume that activism is something that only happens in the left. That's also like ceding rhetorical ground a little bit. Like that's judicial activism, what they're doing on the right. You know, that is like activism for either, you know, Christianity or like whatever your views are on gender. Like that's what that is. Call out consent manufacturing. There's a lot of people who don't know that much about this, but they're like, well, you know, I guess I'll trust the Times. Like, I guess I'll trust the Atlantic. Right. So it's like being mindful again of like authority, which is mediated through rhetoric a lot of times. And then when it comes to being tactical, just like different situations call for different things. You know, sometimes it's don't respond, like sometimes it's call them out according to their own ethics publicly, right? Create a spectacle. Sometimes it's direct action, right? It's like sitting on the floor of the Capitol or what have you. Um, so I think, yeah, it's all kind of like a big ecosystem, and everything, different situations, like different contexts call for different tactics. But on the whole, I think coming out of the Times letter, what I've been like most sort of tuned into is like this idea of like rhetoric being incredibly powerful.
Hmm. Eva, did you want to add anything?
Everyone's made so many good points. Could you repeat the question just one more time?
Yeah. Looking ahead, you know, with the elections, and most likely anticipating an expanded anti-trans movement. What do we need to do to prepare? What's our action plan?
Well, for one, everyone needs to get into therapy because it's going to be a freaking shit show. So that's number one. We all need to really take some time and breathe and get some chamomile tea and like some candles ready. You know, it's time to get the sage out, right? That's the first thing we need to do. Because when you are being attacked on the basis of who you are, it is so emotionally taxing. You know, so yes, we absolutely need to organize. We absolutely, you know, we definitely need to look at strategies. Because yeah, like this is the time to definitely strategize. This is a time to organize. And also, like we gotta take our egos out of it. I'm just gonna speak very candidly. I think very oftentimes when it comes to activist efforts and media activist efforts, you know, a lot of this work gets tied to some sense of like notoriety, celebrity, whatever. And a lot of that can just create so much noise. I know I'm speaking kind of vaguely because I'm not going to name names. I'm not going to be messy. But I've just seen a lot of ego, and a lot of it is taking away from what we need to do, which is to really try to keep each other safe. So, you know, as we go about doing this work, it doesn't matter who gets asked to be on what talk show, who gets asked to be a part of da 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 da. You know, we just got to do it. Because the right, they are more organized, they are more moneyed than we are. And that has a big, big impact. You know, like Tommy Lauren can go into the studio and spend 5 hours talking about how much, you know, these gender freaks freak her out and she's so confused. And what are you? You're using they? I thought you were one person. You know, like people say all these things and it's very easy for them to do that, you know, because it doesn't have any impact on them, right? But when we speak on these things, this has a direct impact on us, and it has a direct impact on the people that we love. So it's very easy to get heated. It's very easy to respond out of anger. You know, we have to take a step back and we have to think about how we respond, why we are responding, because, you know, the way in which we go about this has sadly a bigger impact on why, right? Because this is like, you know, these are some of the tactics in which the far right uses to gaslight us. Um, when we, you know, when we respond and, you know, a lot of this is like tone policing, a lot of it is respectability. You know, it's very, very easy to get caught up and to play and, you know, and to play into the trap that they're constantly trying to set up for us. um I also think, yeah, like, um when it comes to any sort of interviews that any of us do, and not just journalists, even just like the everyday queer trans person, ally, whoever, take a step back and think about who is asking you these questions and why they're asking you these questions. Think about the format in which your answers are going to be published, because it is so easy for them to twist your words, for them to use your image and your likeness in ways that you do not want, in ways in which you do not consent to. But like I said, they're very moneyed. And so, you know, if you sign a contract, if you respond to an email in whatever way, they can use that to justify the ways in which they misuse your voice. So, you know, we all have to be so mindful of that. Like literally every last person, you know, we need to even tell our aunties and our uncles to also keep their mouths shut if they don't know what the hell they're talking about. Because all of this all this misinformation, it's more than TikTok, it's more than Twitter, it's more than social media, it's every day on the street. You know, and that's where a lot of it really starts to manifest. So yeah, we have to really think about that. We have to make sure that all of our people know what to say and what not to say, and also when to speak on everything. Yeah.
And therapy. What an underrated piece of advice. Let's open up the floor to the audience for a Q&A. I think maybe we could do one, maybe two. Clarissa, would you mind sharing a
Yeah.
question with us, please?
Yeah, I can. Our first question is from Lee Marino Klein, who asks, how do y'all take care of yourselves in order to avoid burnout? And then our second question is, what are the stories that you think still haven't been told about your folks?
Go for walks. If you are able to smoke some weed, okay, like get that honey, because it is about to be that time. I know in 2020 it was nothing but clouds in my apartment. Yeah, but yeah, definitely go outside, touch some grass, smoke it too, if that's your ministry. I know it's mine. And also, you know, try to call your friends as much as you can, because with the bombardment of negative news that's out there, whether you're the one writing it or you're simply reading it, it's a lot. It's just a lot to take in. So, you know, I think when doing any form of activism, advocacy, what have you, it can be so easy to be stuck in your apartment, staring at your phone screen, screaming at it, being like, what the hell? Like, I can't believe this is happening right now. Oh my God. Yeah, oh my God, open the window. Okay. Like, feel the sunshine. I think that's the biggest thing that we can do. And in terms of stories that haven't been told, you know, I think queer and trans people in the Midwest and the South are always talked about, but aren't always heard. And I think a lot of their everyday stories are things that need to be talked about. I think, um, there needs to be less of a focus on coastal cities, um, and more of a focus on just like the everyday average trans person who doesn't live in Bushwick and is partied up, like that person who works at Circle K in the middle of like Oklahoma. What are they going through? What does their everyday life look like? These are the stories that really matter.
I'm definitely going to second, touching grass. That is something that, at least for me, works really well. I recently went hiking in Glacier National Park with my fiance Zoe, and it was one of the best things ever. What was really great about it? My phone didn't work for like 24 hours, and that was the best feeling on earth. Y'all, like it can be really hard, whenever you're constantly doom scrolling, and especially if you're in like our position where we are covering this stuff on a daily basis, and there is an endless drip of information because this is like the cultural zeitgeist of our time. It's the thing that people are talking about. Like it will never stop. Like you'll never have a moment where you can turn away and not miss something. And so I think like be kind to yourself and let yourself step away. And this definitely goes so for the people that follow all of the wonderful people here and the people that consume the journalism. I think that, doom scrolling is something that is not unique to people like us here. And I think that it's really important to take those breaks. And it's good for your mental health. Definitely also therapy. I will say therapy is a great thing. It's something that I think if you have the resources and the ability to do so, it's really, it can be a positive thing. But also like there's something else that I want to say, and that's, not everybody has to be an activist in the sense that like you see here, like the people that are like doing activism either in their journalism or like literally just going out to like be the activist at the court hearings and at the legislative chambers. Sometimes the best activism that you can do is just living your own life and showing that like you are a whole person that has all of these cares and wants and needs and things that you enjoy. I often say that like some of the best activists that I've seen are the trans people that go and program a really fun video game, the trans people that go and ride a unicycle. I was actually visiting the University of Connecticut to give a talk, and this is something that I talk about a lot. Like, find those things that are not activism that you enjoy and like lean into those, because those are going to show the world that like trans people have a big diversity of things that we enjoy, and trans people do really cool things. Like trans and queer people I always find like every single trans or queer person I know has this random thing that they're just an expert at, and they're so good at. And at University of Connecticut, sure enough, there was a trans woman riding a unicycle. I just thought it was the coolest thing. But like, I think that, doing that accomplishes two things. It gives you your own outlet of something that you enjoy, something that like brings you joy that isn't necessarily always being plugged into the work, but also it is part of the work. And I know that like somebody in the question and answer thing asked, and I think that this is also covering this, is that what is the purpose of transgender as a form of resistance? This is part of the purpose. It's the idea that like we are whole human beings and that we deserve to be respected as such, but also we deserve to respect ourselves as such. And give yourself that respect. It's important.
I mean, I like to think that this is but a small drop in the sea of human misery over the course of history. And I also like to remember that, I mean, I personally, I can be spite motivated. You don't have to go that route, but I like to remember that the goal is to make us afraid. The goal is for us to shrink into ourselves. The goal is for us to feel immobilized, right? And honestly, like, fun that. So you should like remember that that's the point, and whatever living your life authentically looks like for you, you should do that as much as possible, and you should take care of yourself while you do so. And You should also definitely hang out with a lot of other trans people so you don't feel so isolated in terms of processing what's going on. It does so much, to counteract things just being around other queer and trans people for me personally. So I definitely really recommend that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think touching grass, being around other trans people, having hobbies that aren't like doom scrolling are all basically things that I was gonna touch on. I guess like the question was directed to us personally. Like, I don't know. I really do just like surround myself with like trans people, and I also like maintain, which like it is hard because it's also obviously like these are things that like affect me and my loved ones, like, you know, personally, but I really tried to maintain a very strict like work life separation, which again is way easier said than done. um but like, you know, I find, and it is also something that I'm continually working on. But I think that, and especially kind of, you know, as people have mentioned, like going into 2024, like really like any kind of like marginalized journalist, like that's just gonna be really, really essential. You know, having that strict separation, being like, okay, like when I'm off the clock, like I'm off the clock. Um, and yeah, I don't know. For me, I just, yeah, I also love like having hobbies like with other trans people that have nothing to do with like activism or whatever. I'm gonna take a moment to plug my trans choir, like
Yes.
I'm in a trans choir, and it is like my favorite thing ever, basically. And kind of just like echoing what Muna said, it's just like it's just so nice to like be like surrounded by like trans people doing this completely like not completely, not this thing that's like completely unrelated to transness, because you know like the voice and transness like endlessly intertwined, but like, you know, just a thing that's not like we're not, you know, marching and rallying in the streets at this very moment in time. um and yeah, I don't know, I feel like just echoing what everybody else has said, and also just um yeah, just echoing again like what Muna said. I think that sometimes like I even get in this space where I feel like very like hyper vigilant, and I'm like, oh, like should I even be like going to this thing, like what if like X, Y, and Z happens, like blah blah blah. And I think that, you know, I think that that's not necessarily like a terrible impulse, just considering the state of things. um but yeah, I think just like making space, or just like, you know, being unafraid to like take up space and like gather, because yeah, like the function of a lot of this is just like forcing us out of public life and forcing us out of like our joy and our togetherness. And yeah, I just, those things are so crucial even in the face of all of this, especially in the face of all this.
Right. And what stories haven't been told yet that you're looking forward to seeing? I know Eva touched on non-coastal cities.
Um, if I may, I'm just like already unmuted, so I'm just gonna like say the thing that I was gonna say. I think that like a lot of people like to talk about like and I think that this is something that makes sense, that people kind of try to like validate like modern day trans identity by being like trans people have always existed, like, you know, there were all these like pre-colonial like gender identities that people had, which is like not wrong. But I think there also tends to be this thing that happens when people talk about like these pre-colonial gender identities, where people act as though they don't exist anymore. And I think that like, while I think just like instead of kind of like utilizing like, you know, pre-colonial gender identities as this sort of rhetorical like we were always here thing, I would also just love for more, you know, stories like about like third gender people, by people who identify with these things, both contemporarily and historically, I guess. Yeah, I just think that there's kind of a danger to like historicizing things where people are like, so that was in the past and does not continue to this day, when that's simply not true.
And actually kind of bouncing off of what James said, I don't know if folks have been following what's going on in Uganda, but we do see, like, when we talk about like African or, you know, whatever, pre-colonial, indigenous, what have you, genders and sexualities, like that is very much still a conversation that needs to be happening today, because actually the American far right is exporting their ideologies elsewhere, right? Like to the rest of the world. Like you have the people who were doing the national prayer breakfast at the White House are the people lobbying for the anti-gay bill in Uganda. So it's like it's all mixed up, it's all meshed up. It's very much like something that needs to be understood in terms of empire, which is like not an analysis I see very often. And I think, yeah, that piece about like indigenous and pre-colonial gender is like very much relevant like today. So I agree with James.
Aaron, any sort of trans coverage you want to see? Stories?
You know, I think that there's a few things. Number one, you know, whenever there are stories about transgender youth that are put out there, so often they just don't even talk to the trans youth themselves. And those stories, like the trans youth's stories, are so compelling so often. It's like these kids, they are very open many times. They have so much to share, and their stories are good and passionate and strong. And then, you know, likewise, it's important to show the diversity in trans youth. You know, like I remember a couple years ago, there was a big HRC campaign about trans people, trans kids in sports, and it was like good, like that's good that we're here, that we're running campaigns supporting trans kids in sports. But of course, you know, like it focused on white cis-passing trans kids in sports, not on, you know, any other race, ethnicity, any other experience around being trans and playing sports. Whenever in reality, we often see that it's Black trans people that get affected by the sports bans the worst. And in fact, Black cis people, Black cis gender nonconforming people. And so like, we need to talk about that. Like I think that many of the panelists here have made a very good case for how important it is that we center the many stories of being trans, because there is no one way to be trans. And there are so many different intersections around gender identity. I'll also say the same thing, neurodiversity. You know, like I spoke earlier about like autism, and it has become so important that like we talk about autistic trans people. We're seeing right now states like Florida literally say that if you're autistic, you should be banned from gender affirming care entirely. And like they say, like if you have a concurrent diagnosis, then like you have to treat it. And like, what is treating autism? What is like curing autism, quote unquote? It's troublesome to say the least. And so if we don't get out ahead of this, and we don't actually start to speak about the many narratives that are out there, they're going to capitalize on this. Like, it's not only going to be autistic people either that they bar gender affirming care for. We're starting to see in places like Ohio, anxiety, depression, ADHD. Like, there are so many stories that need to be told, and rather than like, you know, it's not even just a binary decision of like centering trans kids and ignoring them. It's also like, let's talk about the diversity within the trans experience and how beautiful that is. Like, you know, I've spoken in many states, and I've seen the rich diversity of the trans people that come up to me. And it's important that like the world gets to see that, because it's beautiful.
Going off of Aaron's point, I know I answered this prior, but I just want to add on to it. Yeah, you know, the types of trans people who are oftentimes centered in the coverage that we have usually are those who are of more affluent backgrounds, who usually are white, who are cis assumed. And I think we also need to also talk to trans people who are from the hood, you know, we need to talk to you know, all of the trans people who, yeah, really are the ones who are being most impacted, and also the ones who are not a part of these like academic spaces, who don't have like an academic background, whatever. And I think oftentimes when people look for sources, they try to avoid people who maybe don't have like the most PC language and don't speak to things in this very sort of like kosher way. Um, you know, one thing I loved about the work that I did with Vice was that I got to talk to Black and brown trans women from ballroom who also like aren't in ballroom in New York, you know, like they are in Detroit, right? Like they're not people who are gonna like be on Vogue the next day for the category that they won. They're doing it purely because of the love that they have for the art form. Um, but you know, a lot of the girls that I talk to do not feel centered for various reasons. They don't feel heard. Um, Despite the fact that there is a constant discussion when doing these interviews, when doing this work of, oh, well, you know, we need to protect Black trans women. They won't make it past 35. Okay, well, are you going to talk to Black trans women? You know, because there's plenty of them who are past 35. There's plenty of them who are, you know, just trying to like live their life, and who also have things to say, who have very unique viewpoints that are not discussed in the zeitgeist. You know, I think that's one of the most interesting things about a lot of more like liberal media. There is a discussion of certain marginalized groups, sort of like what James said, and yet they're not being talked to, they're not being seen, they're not being heard. Yeah.
I just want to thank all of you for speaking with me today. I also want to thank the team at them for working with us to make this happen. I want to thank our attendees for tuning in. I hope you all leave tonight with a newfound sense of understanding and maybe even feel encouraged to make trans coverage better. And before we leave, I love for my panelists to plug anything they're working on and where we all can follow you and your work.
Everybody can follow me at erinthemorning.com, where I cover anti-trans and anti-queer legislation, as well as cultural issues, life. I try to also put a lot of good news content as well, because so many people need that right now. Likewise, at Erin in the Morn on TikTok, where if you see a red background, just letting everybody know it's probably going to be bad news. If you see a green background, it's good news. I content warn all of my stuff using my lighting, and Erin in the Morn on Twitter.
I just dropped a link to my Twitter in the chat. It's just at Muna_Meyer. And I've got a few things in the pipeline that I can't really talk about, but that will appear on my Twitter shortly.
Also highly recommend just reading Muna's work. I remember a few years ago at Asian American Writers Workshop, there was that, do you remember that Muslim Cool talk he did? It's
That was so long
awesome.
ago. It's a great book too.
That was awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. Eva, James, where can we find y'all?
You can find me on Instagram. I am not on Twitter anymore because mental health matters. Yeah. My Twitter is at Miss Eva Rain. That's MS Eva Rain, not MISS. I didn't do all that. And you can see my movie, Anything's Possible, on Amazon Prime. It's really fun, and it's been out for like not quite a year yet, but we're getting close to that. Yeah, it's a cool trans rom-com. Yeah, just watch it. I'm not gonna say the whole plot.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can look at that, and I am working on other forms of fiction. So
Okay.
yeah, stay tuned for that. That'll be announced in time. Yeah.
Can't believe it's been almost a year already. Yeah.
Yeah, same. It's been a wild year.
James,
Yes. My Twitter is in the chat. My Instagram is the exact same one. Still figuring out how to be a professional on there, but I never really figured that out with Twitter in the first place, so it's fine. And the only other thing that I'm gonna plug is my little trans choir, because we are the literal only classical trans vocal ensemble in existence, and I think that that is really dope. So, yeah.
amazing. And I'm Jenny. I'm covering all things LGBTQ here at Reckon, where you can find my work, including my series When You Were Here. I would love for y'all to sign up for our newsletter, Queerverse, which comes out every Thursday. And we're going to link that in the chat. And that's it, y'all. Thank you again so much. And have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all for coming.